I didn't know
I
that,
see.
that detail. Interesting.
Thank you, Anthony. Has anybody else got any questions, or can we go to Joseph Pearce now, who's waiting patiently?
Is he there? Is Joe there?
Yeah, Joseph's there.
I'm
using my phone here, so I can't see what we're supposed to be doing timetable-wise, but I guess we're going straight into Joe Pearce.
Yes, that's what the timetable says.
So, Joseph Pearce, you're very, very welcome. What time is it over there in Kentucky?
Well, I'm not in Kentucky for starters, but you're only about 800 miles out.
Sorry.
I'm in South Carolina, and it's 8:30 in the morning.
South Carolina. Okay. My American geography's up the spout. Okay, well, I hope you've had your breakfast. Joseph's going to speak to us about why we're moving across the channel now, really. We've been hearing a lot about France. He's going to set the scene of Oscar Wilde and the English Decadence for us. And over to you, Joe.
Thank you so much. Well, it's always good to be in Chavagnes, albeit now in not a very in a virtual way, not in the real concrete way. Actually, I should have been there this past week. In fact, I would have flown directly from France to the Chesterton Conference in Chicago yesterday, and I would actually be in the Chesterton Conference in Chicago now. But of course, the pestilence has changed everything. So instead, we have this online conference, which I'm delighted to be a part of, and I'm really delighted also that we're concentrating on the Decadence, which is not something which gets an awful lot of attention at conferences at Catholic institutions. What I'm going to do, the actual title they gave to my talk is A Portrait of Oscar Wilde and the Landscape of Decadence. So we have a sort of the imagery of two different types of paintings there. What I'm going to try to do in about 5 minutes, because I like telescoping things, it's like a bit, as we're on a virtual theme, it's going to be like a Google map going out and out and out here. So we're starting focus specifically across the channel, as Ferdy says, in England in the 1890s. But I'm going to project everything out. I'm going to look at where the English decadence specifically fits in to Catholic England. So I'm going to give a 3-minute 2,000-year history of England. That shouldn't be that difficult. And then I'll situate it within the Catholic cultural and literary revival, and spend maybe about another 5 minutes on that. And then I'm going to get into the landscape of the English decadence, and then finally end up with the portrait of Oscar Wilde, which I still hope will be the bulk of the talk. So having set myself the challenge, and having had a quick sip of water, and to answer Ferdy, I haven't had any breakfast this morning. I haven't had my first cup of tea, so this is I'm doing this caffeine-free. Okay, so Catholic England, of course, goes back now 2,000 years. Catholicism, Christianity, same thing in those days, of course, arrived in England in the 1st century, and we know that the original Lady Chapel at Glastonbury certainly dates back to the 1st century AD. Whoever was responsible for evangelizing is, of course, a matter of legend. We then have a period of 1,500 years, or 1,400 years, 1,500 years almost, of Catholic England. First of all, under Roman rule, and then remnants of it surviving in England, the England before England, the England before Angleland, if you like. And then the Saxons arrive, and that remnant is challenged by the pagan presence, but the pagan presence is solved by their conversion under St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent by St. Gregory the Great. We then have a golden age in English Catholicism, the age of Anglo-Saxondom, from the end of the 6th century through to 1066. And then we have a contentious issue, which would have Hilaire Belloc and J.R.R. Tolkien in opposite corners of the boxing ring, fighting over whether 1066 was a good or bad thing for Catholic England, with Belloc, who of course was a Francophile to the extreme, arguing that England was irrelevant until the French got involved, and Tolkien, of course, arguing on the contrary, that Old English as a language was a thing of great beauty, which had also produced things of great beauty in terms of literature and theology and history. And of course, Anglo-Saxon England had been a land of saints. But nonetheless, regardless of that argument, England remained Catholic after the Norman Conquest from 1066, and then until Henry VIII, of course, in the 1530s. And then from that time onwards, we have what to me is the most heroic period in English Catholicism, not a period where England had died, so where Catholicism had died, maybe a period when England had died, but that's another issue, but not a period when Catholicism had died, because then we had a period of 3 centuries, 300 years of heroic resistance, 150 years of heroic resistance that included martyrdom up until the 1680s, and another 150 years almost after that until Catholic emancipation. So we have this glorious Catholic landscape of what it is in English culture. And now we're going to zoom in. So Google, Zoom. See, I'm really with it. You know, I'm not the techno-famous people think I am. So we got now zoom into the 19th century, to the period we are dealing with here, and look at the landscape of the English Catholic revival, which begins really with Romanticism, with Wordsworth and Coleridge, to a lesser degree Blake. We have that 47-year gestation period from 1898, the publication of lyrical ballads, to 1845, the conversion of St. John Henry Newman, which is the birthday, if you like, of the Catholic revival in England, having had this 47-year gestation period. And then we have what I call the Newman period, from 1845 until Newman's death in 1890, a 45-year period where Newman is the giant figure, and from that, the absolute giant figure of the poet Jeremiah Manning Hopkins and Coventry Patmore and others come into the picture. We then have, and now we're really zooming in, the decadent interlude. So it is an interlude. It's a period from 1890, the death of Newman, to 1900, the death of Wilde. Oh, it's very neatly, doesn't it? It's a nice decade. And we're just going to go project beyond the landscape of decadence, and I'll come back to it. Then 1900, the year in which Wilde dies, is the year in which Chesterton is first published. So from 1900 to 1936, the death of Chesterton, is a period which I call the Chester Belloc period, where the giant figures of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, if you like, dominated the Catholic landscape of cultural England. Of course, within that, we had other interesting things happening. We had the Wasteland generation, T.S. Eliot, Evening War, Graham Greene, etc. And then Chesterton dies in 1936. In 1937, The Hobbit is published. So I call the period basically from 1937 to the death of J.R.R. Tolkien in 1973, the Inklings period, when the 2 giant figures of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis dominated. And as regards projecting that forward into our time and beyond, enormous significance. The Lord of the Rings is the 3rd largest selling work of literature of all time, behind only Don Quixote and A Tale of Two Cities. And in the top 10 of best-selling works of literature of all time, as well as Lord of the Rings, you will find The Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe, and you'll also find The Hobbit hovering somewhere around the top 10. So the huge influence, if you like, of this Catholic cultural heritage living on vibrantly in the 21st century. So I don't know if that was 3 minutes, but I don't think it was more than 5, which is not bad. Now we're going to zoom in specifically to the landscape of decadence. So I'm going to say something about the English decadent movement in general, and then I'm going to focus in on the portrait of Oscar Wilde. So the English decadence, largely through Wilde's influence, was of course influenced by the French decadence. And I daren't say much about the French decadence in the presence of the learned souls such as Robert Ashe, Anthony O'Hare, and Ferdy McDermott. So I'm going to show my true lack of courage and steer well clear of the whole subject. Except, of course, that from the British perspective, we have to be careful not to call Oscar Wilde an Englishman. When you live in England for a while, then they call everybody in the British Isles English, whether they like it or not. And I becoming infected with the American version of the language. But as regards Britain, through the influence of Wilde, the influence of the French Decadence entered the English literary landscape. So there are the figures, of course, from the Catholic perspective of Charles Baudelaire, who was reconciled with the church on his deathbed, with Paul Verlaine, who converted to Catholicism in prison, and with Joris Huysmans, the novelist who spent the last years of his life hovering on the fringes of a monastery. Well, Wilde spoke very good French and was hugely influenced by French literature. On his honeymoon in Paris, he read Huysmans' decadent masterpiece, Arabeur, translated often as either against nature or against the grain. He said later that he had been poisoned by that book. Now, I don't really think I have too much time to speak about Huysmans' book. It's certainly a book I would hesitate to recommend to well, I would not recommend to high school age, and I would hesitate to recommend it to even college freshmen. I taught it once at Ave Maria University, and I'm surprised I survived the experience. But certainly it's a marvelous book because it ends basically what the whole thesis of the book, and this is important because Wilde really runs with this, with his own life and also with a picture of Dorian Gray. What if there's nothing to stop someone indulging all of their sensual appetites, and there's no consequences in a negative sense, in a physical sense or a legal sense, or it's not impossible for economic reasons? What if there's just no obstacles? You just do what you like. And that's basically the premise for Arabeur, and it ends with a cri de coeur, a cry from the heart to a God he doesn't even know exists for help. So that's really, if you're allowed, if you're given that enough rope, if you like, to hang yourself on a decadent lifestyle, you end up in a state of despair and demoralization and in need of help. And at that point, if you go as far as Decadence did, what you need at that point is grace, is the help of God. So Wilde reads this on his honeymoon in Paris, and you've got to worry about the health of a marriage when that's how Oscar Wilde decides to amuse himself in the hotel room on your honeymoon. But that's probably as far as we need to go in that direction. So very briefly on the other decadents, I do want to mention the other decadents because I won't have, and they are, I notice now we've crossed the channel, that Olive Custance and Lionel Johnson are going to be the topic of talks later on this afternoon. So that's going to be covered somewhat. But I did want to mention the fact that some of the key figures, such as Lionel Johnson and Ernest Dowson, three of my favorite poems from the 19th century are written by Dowson. Nuns of the Perpetual Adoration and Carmelites, the Carthusians, and Extreme Unction, all of which he wrote some marvelous poetry which wasn't Catholic. I'm talking specifically about his Catholic poetry here. Marvelous poetry. And in fact, I chose to conclude my biography of Oscar Wilde with lines, I think anyway, with lines from Dowson's poem Extreme Unction. Aubrey Beardsley, the enfant terrible, the artist of the 1890s, also of course converted to Catholicism, and even Lord Alfred Douglas, Wilde's nemesis, became a Catholic early in the 20th century. So there's something about decadence, at least this literary decadence and this cultural decadence from the Fin de Siècle, which is Catholic. And I want to say something before I get into Oscar Wilde about what this might entail. Of course, there are some that will be uncomfortable with the fact that the Catholic Church is comfortable with dining with publicans and sinners. But of those, Jesus Christ already dealt with that objection, so I don't think we need to worry about that too much. But it seems to me that there are two paths to conversion in the most broadly speaking sense of the word. There's the high road and the low road, and I'm not going to sing the Scottish song, you'd be pleased to know, but you can either take the high road to conversion, if you like, the path of sanctity, or you can take the low road, the Mary Magdalene path, the path of misery, and ultimately coming to your senses in the gutter. And so it's that low road really is the trajectory which gives, paradoxically, life to the decadent movement. Of course, even all saints are sinners, and even those that take the high road, such as, for instance, Newman and Hopkins and Chesterton, are also sinners. It's not as though they don't have problems. It's not an immaculate road. That is a road of sinners. But it's a road where there's a genuine and obvious striving after holiness for the bulk of the life, as opposed to a life of self-indulgence in which at the last the prodigal son returns home smelling of pigs, okay, and then seeking conversion. I've probably left aspects of the decadence out because I am, of course, trying to cover a lot here, but I've still got half an hour left, and this allows me now to hone in on our portrait of Oscar Wilde. Now, many of the books I've written have been the fruits of provocation. In other words, I'm normally provoked into writing some of my books. So my biography of Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a consequence of my feeling that Scammell and other biographers of Solzhenitsyn had not paid due attention to the centrality of Solzhenitsyn's Christianity, his Orthodox Christianity, to his life and work and struggle. Solzhenitsyn evidently agreed. That's why the main reason I believe he gave me the right to go to Moscow and interview him for. My biography, my first book on Tolkien, Tolkien Man and Myth, was written as a reaction against the dismissive way in which The Lord of the Rings was shot down with sort of patronizing vitriol by the critics following its emergence in several opinion polls in 1996 and 1997. Before Jackson's film, by the way, so let's not believe that The Lord of the Rings is only popular because of Peter Jackson's movie. This was all before the first of the Jackson films came out. So, you know, basically, one critic said, this just shows the folly of teaching people to read. So, you know, I thought, well, these people have quite clearly never even read The Lord of the Rings, because none of the dismissive attitude towards it engaged the text at all. It was merely pride and prejudice speaking. So I thought, well, let's respond. So with Oscar Wilde, my response really was due to the fact that he was seen to be emerging by the end of the 20th century, so a century or so after his death, with as an icon for the homosexual movement, and I just thought this was a scandalous misrepresentation of who Oscar Wilde was, what his art proclaimed, and what ultimately his life and work represents. And this was brought home to me when I was, shortly after my biography was published, when I was asked to take part in a centenary celebration of Oscar Wilde in 2000, on the centenary of his death, which took place at, I can't remember which the name of the theatre is, on the South Bank in London. And you know, I gave my talk and what have you, and other things were going on. But then there was a one-man performance of Wilde's poem, sorry, not Wilde's poem, Wilde's prose work, De Profundis, by, someone can help me here, Vanessa Redgrave's younger brother, Corin Redgrave. Corin Redgrave did a one-man show. Now, when De Profundis was first published in the early 20th century, all of the vitriolic spleen venting against Lord Alfred Douglas had been excised. So all we had was this nice clean, pristine statement of Wilde's conversion and embrace of Catholic Christianity, all nice and clean. But when Corin Redgrave did his dramatic presentation of De Profundis, all of the Christian element had been excised, and only the vitriolic spleen venting against Lord Alfred Douglas remained. In other words, all that Wilde now was someone who's important in relation to his relationship to Lord Alfred Douglas and his homosexual lifestyle. So that's what I sought to address in my book, because it seems to me that Wilde has had stones thrown at him from both sides. The Puritans stone him for his decadent lifestyle, and the decadents, insofar as they understand his Catholicism, stone him for not ultimately embracing the decadent lifestyle. Let me just read briefly from the beginning of my book, because I think I say it better there than I'm going to say it if I try to say it here. This is from the preface. The problem stems from an inability to see Wilde except through the lens of either Puritan or prurient motives. The prurient see Wilde as a subversive hero who undermines traditional values. For this school of thought, his value is not primarily in his art, but in his licentious life, encapsulated in the lurid title of Melissa Knox's study as Wilde's, quote, long and lovely suicide. Against the prurient is counterposed the Puritan, who believes that Wilde's work lacks value because of his immoral life. The most extreme example of the Puritan school of thought was St. John Irving, whose conclusion to his appraisal of Wilde, published in 1952, is particularly scathing, and I'm going to read it. Wilde came into the world with a small talent and made little of it. He did worse than that. He denied his principles by his practice. He cast such pearls as he had before swine, and then wallowed with the swine as at the troughs in the sty. He was a flippant man who turned high matters to bibblers' jests, and would not forego a witticism to spare a friend's wound. A brawler in the temple may be sincerely affirming a faith, but a man who titters in the temple and is flippant about his faith is a recusant who denies without any affirmation in the denial. The steward who hid his talent in a napkin was cursed and condemned. But what punishment is fitting for the man who takes his gift from God and drops it in the mire? That was the sin committed by Oscar Wilde. It was the sin against the Holy Ghost. So we see here in the judgment of St. John Irving, there's no doubt at all that Oscar Wilde is currently burning in hell. And let me I'm going to jump over the next paragraph because I want to make sure I have enough time. Just the final paragraph of the preface here. We are all in the gutter, says Lord Darlington in Lady Windermere's Fan, but some of us are looking at the stars. Look for Wilde in the gutter, whether to wallow with him in the mire or to point the finger of self-righteous scorn is to miss the point. Those wishing a deeper understanding of this most enigmatic of men should not look at him in the gutter, but with him at the stars. So this is the approach that I endeavor to take. And I hope to a degree I've achieved that in the book. During the research for the book, one thing I found very interesting, I got access to the original manuscript of De Profundis, written by Wilde, of course, while he was in prison. And it's very interesting because, you know, he obviously wrote it in certain stages, but when he's writing about the faith, his handwriting is really beautiful and small. He's clearly, you know, at peace with himself as he tries to expound upon his understanding of Christianity and Catholicism as respect to civilization and aesthetics, etc. And then when he's writing about Lord Alfred Douglas, his handwriting becomes very large, and you can see, if you like, the violence and the aggression in the actual flow of the hand. That it's obviously written in haste, and it's large, and the man's obviously angry as he's writing it. So you've got this. There's something about De Profundis which is, to a degree, schizophrenic. It's a man who, on the one hand, knows where peace lies, and he also knows where the absence of peace in his life comes from, which is the licentious lifestyle he had chosen. In De Profundis, Wilde refers to his homosexuality as a pathology, as a sickness. Now, the irony that we need to bear in mind here is that in the 21st century, saying something like that in many countries would be a criminal offense. We live in an age of intolerance where we cannot talk about the homosexual lifestyle in anything but laudatory ways, because if we say anything else, we are homophobic, which is a thought crime punishable by imprisonment in certain countries. So Wilde, far from being a gay icon, is actually, in fact, someone who is not comfortable with that lifestyle and has actually condemned it. So when he was received into the church on his deathbed, we have an enigma. Because, yes, this is a man that very few people would have seen as a Catholic writer, although if they dug a bit deeper in some of his works, they would not have as much difficulty as they might have thought. But in many ways, this was the conclusion to Oscar Wilde's life in both senses of the word. It was obviously the conclusion in the sense of being the physical end of his mortal life, and its conclusion in that sense, but it was also the conclusion and the end in the other sense, that the feat of to find himself, if you like, seeking entry into the church was the logical place he should have been at the time he made the choice. In other words, the whole of his life was a flirtatious and not always faithful love affair with the Catholic Church, which goes back to his undergraduate days. The evidence, by the way, for his deathbed conversion is inescapable, because I know that some of Wilde's decadent admirers who are uncomfortable with his Christianity deny this and call it a lie by Robert Ross. But we do need to remember that there was another person present who neither Wilde nor Robert Ross knew at the time. That was Father Cuthbert Dunn, who Ross, presumably at Wilde's requested to be there to give Wilde the last rites of the church, to receive him into the church, to give him extreme unction. We have two separate accounts of Wilde's final moments and his reception into the church, one by Robert Ross and one by Father Cuthbert Dunn. So both the people who were physically there. These two accounts are given a couple of decades apart. The two men didn't know each other beforehand and never met again afterwards. These are two independent accounts by the two people there, and they completely and utterly harmonize with each other. So there's no factual documentary reason to doubt Wilde's reception into the church. So it goes right back, however, to his undergraduate days. So when Wilde went to Trinity College Dublin, he very quickly found himself under the influence of John Henry Newman, who was no longer there at that point, but he'd obviously been in Dublin for a while, and there were certainly people who had known Newman, including priests who had known Newman, became friends of Wilde during his time at Trinity College Dublin. Now his father, Wilde's father, who was very anti-Catholic, decided that he would have to take Wilde out of this papist environment at Trinity College Dublin. And so he sent him from Trinity College Dublin to finish his undergraduate studies at Oxford University. Now, of course, anybody knows anything about Oxford University in the 1870s will know that it was a hotbed of Catholicism. Again, the influence of Newman was palpable. The influence of the Oxford movement was palpable. So moving Wilde from Trinity College Dublin in order to take him away from the grip of the papists was like taking him out of the frying pan and putting him into the fire, because obviously Oxford was alive with Catholicism in the 1870s. So Wilde very quickly started attending Mass in Oxford, including at St. Aloysius, which is, of course, the church still there now, an Oratorian church. In Wilde's time was a Jesuit church. There's evidence that Wilde was attending St. Aloysius Church at around the time that Gerard Manley Hopkins might have been a curate there, but I found no way of showing that the two men ever met, unfortunately. So Wilde is actually mixing with Catholics. Many of his friends are converting to Catholicism. He's staying up all night, arguing about the tenets of the faith. His private correspondence make it perfectly clear he's completely au fait with the deeper doctrines of the faith. He knows what Catholicism is, not just in terms of an emotional response, but in terms of a rational understanding. Another key reason, a way of knowing that Wilde, where Wilde stood aesthetically at this time, by the way, is that the two giant figures, the two giant aesthetes, if you like, on a philosophical level at Oxford at the time were John Ruskin and Walter Pater. And Pater represented the decadent school, if you like, and Ruskin the more traditional school. So Ruskin, for instance, would his understanding of the history of the Renaissance was, and I think it was Ruskin who said this, that Venice had descended from being a Renaissance virgin, from being a medieval virgin to being a Renaissance Venus. So you have this erotic metamorphosis, or this venereal metamorphosis, to use the adjectives. In other words, that the Renaissance became decadent. And for Ruskin, this was not a good thing. Walter Pater, on the other hand, agreed with the thesis, but said it was a good thing. That basically, what the Renaissance did was liberate itself from Christianity and move forward, if you like, boldly into a world that's not tethered by traditional morality. Both of these men, of course, also flirted with Catholicism, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion. But what's really interesting is, although Wilde tends to quote Pater more than he quotes Ruskin, it's quite clear from his correspondence at the time that in this civil war, this intellectual and aesthetic civil war going in Oxford at the time, Wilde is solidly on the side of Ruskin against Pater. He even actually becomes one of Ruskin's disciples and went out on at least one occasion digging trenches or building roads as one of Ruskin's sort of medievalist projects to revitalize agrarian England. If anybody can get Oscar Wilde to actually lift a shovel in physical labor, at that point at least, Wilde must have been really besotted with Ruskin as a man. Where Wilde fit on the theological doctrinal spectrum is evident by the pictures he had in his rooms at Oxford as an undergraduate. So he had a picture of Cardinal Manning and a picture of Pio Nono, St. Pius IX. Oh, sorry, Pius IX. I don't think he's been canonized, has he? Someone shake your head or nod your head. I don't think Pius IX's not been canonized, has he?
Blessed Pius IX.
Sorry? Blessed.
Blessed.
Blessed. Did you say blessed, Ferdy? Okay. Yeah, he's in heaven then. That's good. So what does this mean? Well, of course, again, in England at this time, Cardinal Manning represented the ultramontanes, those that were fully gung-ho with papal infallibility, and fully gung-ho with the papacy, as against the more timid approach, shall we say, of those who were not. And so Newman was on the side of the inopportunists, and this, by the way, this is not, people on either side have not become heretics. But the point is, from the point of view of someone, should we say, knee-jerk political politics, okay? Wilde was a 19th century equivalent of a trad, right, of an even somewhat maybe angry trad. They have a picture of Cardinal Manning as opposed to Cardinal Newman, who he also greatly admired, on his wall, and also a portrait of Pius IX. He put him in the ultramontane school of things. Then in 1878, Wilde visited Father Sebastian Bowden at Brompton Oratory in London, with a view to being received into the church. And we have a wonderful letter from Father Bowden, which I quote in my biography, where he really basically, you can see Wilde's weakness. You can see that Wilde is something of a butterfly and a dilettante who has the right beliefs, but doesn't have the resolution or the courage or the fortitude to follow through with his beliefs. And in many ways, Father Bowden's, if we had more time, I'd read it, but in many ways, Father Bowden's letter to Wilde, it serves as a prophecy of the trajectory Wilde's life would go once he stopped having conversion as his focus. It went, if you like, into a downward spiral spin. We also see an element of where Wilde's life might go in his love affair with Florence Balcombe. And for me, I don't think Wilde's a great poet. He's a great playwright, and I think Picture of Dorian Gray is one of the greatest novels. But most of his poetry I find to be not that great. There were some wonderful lines. I mean, some of my favorite lines are from The Bell of the Reading Jail. I'm quoting all the time, but as a whole, anyway, that's another thing. But some of his finest poetry actually is love poetry written to Florence Balcombe. I called it his Florentine poetry in the biography to give it a name. And he's clearly very much in love with her, but also, so I see Florence Balcombe in some sense. I'm feeling very much like an American here because I'm watching everybody pouring out fermented and distilled beverages, and it's only 9:05. And I feel like if I were to do that, we're actually going to see some friends on a lake about an hour's drive south of here this afternoon. I should be imbibing liberally later, but if I started imbibing now, I would be a real mess by lunchtime. So I'm not going to join you. I've just got straightforward water, and even that's almost run out. But I see Florence Balcombe in some sense, his relationship with Florence Balcombe as a metaphor for his relationship with the Catholic Church, because he's clearly in love with her. He clearly, if he had more gravitas about him in terms of fortitude and practical action, he would have proposed them and she would have accepted. That's quite clear. But he dillied and dallied, flitted here and there, neglected her, did not show the essential ingredient of love, which is self-sacrifice, laying down your life for the beloved. Showed none of that. In other words, he showed his selfishness in his relationship with her, and in consequence, she went off and married someone else. Now, we have a very learned company here. Someone tell me, who did Florence Balcombe end up marrying? I know Robert Ash will know, nobody else.
Bram Stoker. Bram
Stoker, exactly. Yes, indeed. Went off to marry the author of Dracula. But I see in that relationship, if you like, the seeds of Wilde's weakness in giving himself, whether it be for the church, for Christ, for a woman. And of course, the woman who he did marry, Constance, I mean, she's not an ideal person. She also dallied with some Aleister Crowley's stuff, The Golden Dawn. I mean, she's certainly not a Beatrice figure. But I think she does emerge nonetheless, Constance Wilde, as the heroine of the story, because she's the victim of Wilde's selfishness, as are, of course, the two innocent victims, his two young sons. And even though she was treated so abysmally by him, and her life, in a worldly sense, was ruined by him, and the life of their sons was also, the childhood at least, was ruined because of it. She never actually condemned him. She actually said, one of my favorite sayings that she has of him, Wilde is weak but not wicked. And it'd be very easy for Constance to become vitriolic, as Wilde did towards Lord Alfred Douglas, for instance. Okay, so I'm now going to discuss, because we don't have much time left, the picture of Dorian Gray. as aspects, if you like, of Wilde's own character and what the novel as a whole tells us about Wilde's character and who Wilde is. Then I'm just going to finish up with a little bit about the prison sentence and the aftermath, and we've already discussed the conversion. So basically, the three principal characters of the Picture of Dorian Gray, as I'm sure you know, are Basil Hallward, the artist, Lord Henry Wotton, the critic, and Dorian Gray, who is the one, if you like, who falls under the influence of the critic. So there's an aspect of Oscar Wilde in all three of those, right? He wrote an essay called The Critic as Artist. Wilde was an artist, right? No one's going to deny that he was a writer of considerable literary talent. But he was also a critic, and very often an iconoclastic and cynical one, a la Lord Henry Wotton. Dorian Gray's lifestyle in some way serves as a prophecy of where Wilde's lifestyle is going. He'd already commenced upon this lifestyle at the time he wrote this, but the obviously unfolding of it, his own life really became a mirror of Dorian Gray's life. So the book itself, however, contradicts the preface, because if you're taught this in the secular academy, which is seems to be in the process of committing suicide at the moment, which will be unlamented as far as I'm concerned. But if you read, if you're taught Picture of Dorian Gray in the secular academy, the emphasis will be on the anecdotes in the preface. There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are either well written or poorly written, and that's all. In actual fact, the book itself clearly contradicts the preface, right? The book is clearly a cautionary tale, very similar to Arabur, of what happens if a man just indulges his appetites without caring a hoot about anybody else. What happens to the man and what happens to people he knows? In other words, if you give someone who's determined to live a hedonistic, nihilistic lifestyle, if you give them enough rope, they'll hang themselves, but not before they've hung other people first. And that's basically exactly what A Picture of Dorian Gray lays out before us. Now, it's not me saying this, Wilde himself said it. So when the book was condemned for being immoral because of its subject matter, which obviously touched upon all sorts of things which made the Victorians feel uneasy talking about things, particularly of a sexual nature, he came out in his defense and said, far from being an immoral book, it's very much a moral book. And if it has a weakness, it's because its moral is too obvious. So that's Wilde's position on the book. And ultimately, at the end of it, the moral can be summed up that if you kill your conscience, you kill yourself. That the death of your conscience, if you succeed insofar as you succeed in killing your conscience, you have killed yourself. You've already died before your death, spiritually. So then we have the prison sentence. And again, it's very important for us to know that Wilde would never have been hounded down by the Victorian establishment for the lifestyle he chose. That lifestyle was being lived by many people, and the Victorians, like all societies, had very carefully turned a blind eye, and that seems to be the way that the modus operandi, modus vivendi, that works best. But what Wilde did when Lord Alfred Douglas's father accused him of being a sodomite, he sued Lord Alfred Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, for libel. And this was Wilde's big mistake, egged on by Lord Alfred Douglas, who hated his father. And so in order to defend himself, Marquis of Queensberry got private detectives, got all the evidence he needed to prove that Wilde was not only posing as a sodomite, but was clearly living as one. And all of this was dredged up and dragged up in court, but where Wilde was the actual person who was prosecuting. He was the plaintiff, not the defendant. And it was, but now that all this evidence was in the light of day, At that point, the legal process is in place and a crime has been shown to have been committed beyond any reasonable doubt in the libel case, then the legal system has no option as a mechanism but to follow through with the prosecution. So Wilde basically shot himself in that. And then he wrote about this, of course, David Fundas, he wrote In Prison, and the poem he wrote about his experience in prison was The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which contains some of my favorite lines of all poetry, which gets to the heart of the mystery of suffering, when he says, but God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone. For how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in? And there we really see, I think, that Wilde getting to the depths, same way that Hopkins does in poems such as The Wreck of the Deutschland, that Wilde's experience in prison was a hell which actually turned into a purgatory. And in my biography of Solzhenitsyn, there's actually a chapter called Hell into Purgatory, because that was Solzhenitsyn's experience, was that prison was purgative. It actually healed him and allowed him to convert to Christianity. The same thing happened with Oscar Wilde. You wouldn't call Solzhenitsyn and Oscar Wilde similar people, but they certainly came to similar conclusions from similar experiences. Also, Wilde, by the way, read the whole of Dante's Divine Comedy while he was in prison in the original Italian. So as we've said, just to conclude, that Wilde's conversion as regards the landscape of decadence, so zooming out again, Wilde's conversion was not an exception, but the rule in many sense. We mentioned Baudelaire, Verlaine, Huysmans, Ernest Dowson, lesser known things like Andrei Mikhailovich, John Gray, who was alleged to be the physical model for Dorian Gray, not only converted, but became a Catholic priest.
Beardsley.
Robert Ross, Lionel Johnson, and as I said, even Lord Alfred Douglas himself. I'm going to actually conclude by some wisdom of another convert from almost 100 years later, someone who was received into the church in 1982, and that's Malcolm Muggeridge. And when Muggeridge was received into the church, he was interviewed, and there was a cynical journalist. And the cynical journalist says, well, Mr. Muggeridge, you know, you've had a great deal of fun in your life. And now you have converted to Catholicism when you're 78 years old, when, if you don't mind my saying so, you're a bit too old to be having that sort of fun anyway. Do you regret all the fun you had prior to your decrepit conversion? Now, obviously, I'm paraphrasing to make the point, but that was the gist of the question. And Muggeridge's response was brilliant. Because Muggeridge said, I don't regret, I regret all the sins in my life, especially insofar as they've hurt other people, which is a brilliant riposte, because the greatest victim of Muggeridge's licentious lifestyle was his long-suffering wife, Kitty. So that's the first perfect response. You know, having fun hurts people and not just yourself. But he says, but I don't regret my past insofar as it has led me to my present. He said, every man's life is a passion play. And insofar as our life leads us to the foot of the cross, we can't regret the path, even if we might regret the hurt that we caused on the path. Muggeridge's response, I think, is a perfect encapsulation of the response that all of these decadent conversions would have given. He regrets his sins, but every man's life is a passion play. And the point is, do we, in the end, find ourselves at the foot of the cross, or do we spurn the cross and, in refusing to carry the cross, crucify ourselves and others with it? I just want to finish by talking about Oscar Wilde's fairy stories. I'm not going to talk about them, I'm going to allude to them, because of course, you know, The Happy Prince and The Canterville Ghost are wonderful stories, and we can hope, I think, regardless of his decadent lifestyle and the hurt he caused to himself and others, that like the Happy Prince, he is now living happily ever after. Thank you.
Hey. Thank you.
And thank you. What we got?
Nice,
That was only
nice fairy tale ending there.
fairy tale ending to an Oscar Wilde, a life of Oscar Wilde. How about that? Who thought it was possible?
Nice.
So did you want questions? So I kept it to 50 minutes, which is not bad. 5 minutes.
If there was absolutely fascinating.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions and chit chat. And then just to let people know what the plan is, we've got 10 minutes for a little chit chat. And then after that, we're going to